Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Bellevue Brief, the podcast from the team at Bellevue Law. This is one of our special 10-minute episodes on the Employment Rights Act, where we are going to discuss the big changes that are coming in employment law and break them down into practical, actionable insights for businesses and HR leaders. I'm Imogen Finnegan, a senior consultant at Bellevue Law, and I'm joined by my colleague and fellow senior consultant, Lee Edgar. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Imogen. I am really looking forward to getting into today's topic, which is the unfair dismissal changes that are coming in, because this is one of the most significant shifts, I think, that we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we start, we should note that we are recording this at the end of January. And so it's still possible that details or timescales might change, although I think that with these particular changes that we're going to discuss today on unfair dismissal, the direction of travel is pretty clear. So let's kick off with the basics. What is the current position on unfair dismissal rights and what is it changing to?
So at the moment, employees need 2 years' service before they can claim ordinary unfair dismissal. And under the Employment Rights Act 2025, that qualifying period is being reduced dramatically down to 6 months. The original proposal, you remember, was that it was going to be a day one right, but Parliament settled on a compromise at 6 months qualifying service.
Yes, and the key date for this is the 1st of January 2027, when that shorter qualifying period is due to come into force. So obviously that will be relevant for all new hires that are being made in the second half of this year, because all employees starting from the 1st of January onwards will have that qualifying period as at the 1st of January. But it's also worth noting that this isn't just relevant for new hires, because those employees who are currently in the business with under 2 years service, but who will have 6 months service as at the 1st of January, will also have those unfair dismissal rights when the new law comes into effect. And so this isn't something that employers can be putting off until Christmas. We would really advise that they're looking at employees in their business now who will fall into that latter category and have those unfair dismissal rights as at the 1st of January 2027. And if there are underperformers, they might want to consider beginning some performance management processes with them now.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And that's only part of the picture, isn't it? Because the second big change is regarding the potential value of unfair dismissal claims. Currently, there is a cap on compensation, which is the lower of a year's salary or the statutory cap, which is currently around £118,000. But the Employment Rights Act 2025 is going to remove that cap entirely. And so unfair dismissal compensation will become unlimited. We don't have a confirmed date of that part of the legislation yet, do we? But the expectation is that the removal of that cap will align with the new qualifying period. So again, 1st of January 2027. And I really wonder whether we will see a surge in high value unfair dismissal claims as a result of this.
Yeah, I think on the face of it, it looks really significant, doesn't it? And the potential liability for employers, you can see that it could quite easily run into six figures for the high earning senior execs, and also for employees who are out of work for really long periods of time after they've left, which I think in the current market, the job market, which is difficult, we're seeing a lot more of that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that employees still have to prove their actual financial losses in an unfair dismissal claim, and they will continue to have a duty to mitigate their losses. In other words, they have to take reasonable steps to find a new job. And if you can secure a new role quickly, then obviously the compensation available to you if you're bringing an unfair dismissal claim will be reduced accordingly. So I think that whilst these changes look quite dramatic and undoubtedly there will be a rise in higher value claims, I think that those existing principles of proving loss and mitigating loss may well reduce the overall impact of this change.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think. But because tribunals do take mitigation seriously, but even with those safeguards, the uncapped compensation, I think, still increases uncertainty, doesn't it, for employers? In the current system, you usually have a sense of the worst case financial exposure, but once the cap goes, even if many claims ultimately settle at modest levels, the potential for higher awards may make employers more cautious in contentious exits, I think, and could drive up settlement values simply because the upper limit is no longer there.
Yes, absolutely. And so with that in mind, I think the first 6 months of employment, effectively the probation period, becomes a really critical window for employers. And historically, I think you'd probably agree, probation periods hasn't always been taken very seriously by employers.
Yeah, absolutely. Most businesses set probationary periods. They will be in their contracts. They may be 3 or 6 months, but many employees pass by default because no one's had the time or the confidence to have the difficult conversations early on. But with these changes, I think that approach becomes really risky.
Yeah. And if you realise now at month 7 that someone isn't the right fit, either because of their performance or their conduct, then it's going to be too late. So probation periods are going to need to be really well structured and active and well managed by businesses. So what practical steps do you think employers can take to manage this?
Well, I think first you have to start with the hiring process, because if the risks of a poor hire are going up, then the investment in good recruitment needs to go up too. So I think that means clearer job descriptions, better prepared interview panels, structured interviews, and realistic assessments of what good looks like in the role.
Yeah, and I would also add that I think it's really important for employers to be honest about what a role involves and the challenges that might be involved in a role. Because in my experience, a mismatch of expectations is one of the most common reasons that a new hire doesn't work out. And proactive performance management in the early months will become really important. So once somebody's in the door, managers will need to be having regular, meaningful check-ins, perhaps weekly in the first month and then moving to fortnightly. And I would really emphasize the meaningful part of that. So not just how are you doing, how are you settling in, how are you finding things, but actually more targeted conversations about performance, behavior, cultural fit, and importantly, whether there are any concerns on either side.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Concerns should be addressed early. I think that's the key, isn't it? Not saved up for the end of the probation. And so short, informal feedback conversations can often fix issues before they become big problems, can't they? And I think managers often avoid difficult conversations because they feel awkward or they don't want to demotivate somebody at the start. But the cost of avoidance is definitely going up. So equipping managers with practical skills, for example, how to give constructive feedback, how to document informal discussions so that there's the paper trail that you might need later on, or how to handle emotion. I think those are all going to be essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of managers often forget that a probation period extension is also an option. So if someone is borderline for passing their probation, then an extension can be really useful as long as it's paired with some clear expectations about what the next section of the probation period needs to look like. And with this new 6-month qualifying period, that might look like an initial probation period of 3 months with the possibility to extend by a further 3 months if somebody is in that borderline category. So Lee, let's talk briefly about high earners, because obviously this uncapped compensation really changes the risk profile for these employees quite dramatically.
Yeah, definitely. A senior hire who isn't performing can be costly in multiple ways, obviously, lost revenue, misaligned strategy, cultural impact. But once you're past that 6-month threshold now, removing them becomes much more expensive. So again, early clarity, early feedback, even at a high level, and taking decisive action if things aren't working, I think is really important.
Yeah, and for very, very senior roles, employers might want to consider fixed term contracts. They don't negate the unfair dismissal risks, but they can be useful in setting expectations for an initial period of employment with a kind of active review point at the end. Longer probation periods, i.e. using that first 6 months to its maximum. And also I think what we've touched on before at the front end, which is really rigorous assessment processes during hiring and onboarding.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And before we wrap up, there's one more procedural change, isn't there, worth mentioning? From this October, so from October 2026, the time limit for bringing most employment tribunal claims, including unfair dismissal, is going to be extended from 3 months to 6 months. So that gives employees a much longer window to decide whether to bring a claim.
Yeah, and this, taken with the 6-month qualifying period and the uncapped compensation, is really contributing to quite a broad shift, and a time where employers will need to be much more considered and more defensible in the way that dismissals are carried out, as well as having clear documentation for all the decisions that they're making.
Yeah, the pattern of reforms is really increasing the scrutiny of employer decisions, isn't it? And the Employment Rights Act really shifts the burden onto employers to be more intentional and proactive.
Yes, and HR teams should start preparing now. As we've said, this is not something that can be left until Christmas. Updating contracts, probation policies, reviewing manager training, which we've talked about, equipping managers with those skills, and looking at recruitment processes to really support good decision making.
Yeah, I agree. If employers put the right structures in place, this doesn't have to be a headache. It can actually lead to better hiring, stronger teams, and much less risk.
Yes, I think so. Agreed. I think that's all we've got time for in today's episode of the Bellevue Brief. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
And yes, if you'd like support reviewing your contracts and policies, or with training or preparing for the upcoming changes to unfair dismissal rights, then our team at Bellevue Law will be happy to help. So join us next time for another mini episode on the Employment Rights Act 2025.